I hope everybody is doing good. Doing well, I guess. Maybe better English. Anyway, today we're going to talk about something a little different, but basically the same, of course, because we're talking about bullying. And today we're going to talk about why do bullies bully? And the reason this is super important is because we have a tendency to see and look at bullies one particular way. We see them as um, being that type of a person, like that they are somebody else, which of course they are. But what I mean is we kind of other them as being those kind of people. And so there's a lot of myths about workplace bullying. And one of these is that people who bully in the workplace are high conflict people, or they have personality disorders. That just like the schoolyard bully, the workplace bully also stands out. And the reason that is so problematic is that that's not been my experience in the workplace. Is in the workplace, bullies are just like everybody else. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but bullies can have personality disorders. Of course they can. But they can also be people just like you and I. And meaning that bullies come into the workplace and they might be okay people. But when we think of bullies as having personality disorders or being high conflict people, people who stand out in the workplace, then the problem becomes is we see people who bully as those people, not ourselves, and that becomes extremely problematic. And the reality is when we have our work culture and our organization, our culture of our work influences how we behave professionally. And in a bully culture or a culture where there's workplace bullying, it's 100% extremely dysfunctional. But the stuff that's rewarded is bullying, not confronting bullying or speaking up. And so then over time, people are socialized into the roles that exist in a bully culture, which are bystanders, the person who's being bullied, and the bully or bullies, if as in some cases. And so those are the roles. And so you learned that bad behavior or bullying behavior is what gets you ahead. That's the behavior that's rewarded. That's the behavior that's protected. And so what that means is that it isn't just people who have high conflict personalities or personality disorders. And I'm going to argue that yes, there are sometimes bullies who have those things, that the majority of people who bully in the workplace are everyday people who have learned how to become bullies because they've been socialized in it through socialization in their workplace. And so they've learned to become workplace bullies because that's powerful. And that happens again over time. I don't think there are very many people, honestly, who come into the workplace and say, I'm going to be a workplace bully. And it's subtle and it happens over time. So the reason that we like to believe it's people with personality disorders and high conflict people is that means in the workplace, I'm not a bully. It then gives a pass to any bully who's not a high conflict person or a person who has a personality disorder. And so we like those ideas, right? The narcissist, okay? Yes, there are people who have a diagnosis of narcissism, But there are also people who can be like narcissists in the workplace because they've learned that behavior and they've been socialized into that role, and they know that that type of behavior, aka bullying, is what gets them ahead. And so, and the other thing that buying into and believing those myths about who can and cannot be a bully is then when you have somebody who is seemingly nice in the workplace, who is an okay person, who might be an okay worker, is we then think that that person can't be a bully. And so then we excuse people's behavior rather than calling it out. And so it becomes very problematic to believe in these myths around why people bully. The reality is, and I know that I've said this before, is we haven't done a lot of research on workplace bullies for two reasons. Bullies aren't stepping up to the plate to be researched, and how we have viewed workplace bullying, we view it, lots of people view it as an interpersonal conflict issue rather than an organizational problem. And that also limits the ability to accurately both understand workplace bullying and to research it effectively. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've seen being a person in the workplace who was bullied. First off, bullies come and go. So you might have one workplace bully today. If they leave that job, you can have another bully tomorrow. Okay? And if bullying was a high conflict personality problem, when the person left, so should the bullying. But oftentimes what happens is the high conflict personality, again, if we're using that term to label the bully, that person, when they leave, then bullying should leave. But we know that that doesn't happen, because what happens is when there's a vacancy for a bully or the role of workplace bully, what happens is there's a role shift and somebody takes over that position, because that's the highest power and most valuable position in the workplace, is to be the workplace bully. And so bystanders can roll over into that position, and so can people who are bullied roll over into that position. Okay? So if it was really just about the person, or even if it was about the victim, right? Because we do a lot of victim blaming and saying, well, you're being bullied because, you don't quite fit in, or you are like this, or you're like that. Then the argument should also be made is when I left the workplace, bullying should have stopped. And in fact, it didn't. It just continued on its merry way. It's because the person, aka the bully, and the person who's being bullied, they are not the only people involved. So who does bully? Well, so bullying is a learned behavior. Yes, you can have people who have some of those tendencies before they come into the workplace, but if you have a workplace that stops them and holds them accountable, they modify their behavior or they leave the workplace. When you have a workplace that has had bullying for a long time, when you get people to come in, or even when it's just starting, when you don't hold that bad behavior accountable, bullying continues and it happens. And then people are socialized into the positions of bullying. Okay? And so we also have this idea that, to be a strong leader, you have to be tough. And when I say tough, I mean abuse your colleagues. Okay? That's just ridiculous. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Okay? When you have tough leaders who use their leadership as a weapon, they have learned that leadership skill from somewhere. Okay? And so, again, the idea of believing that bullies are that type of person makes you feel like you can't be a bully. And anybody who works in an organization can become a bully. Okay. And the other thing is too, is we are humans, and we are a little bit, if you think about it, to Pavlov's dogs, right? When the bell rang, they started salivating. And it's the same thing in the workplace, is when bullying gets rewarded, when Bob insults me and that is, Bob's not held accountable, or nobody says anything to Bob, and somebody might laugh along with Bob, that's like rewarding Bob. And those subtle rewards and consequences happen all the time. And for Bob, he utilizes more bullying behavior when he knows he can get away with more and more and more and more. So it's problematic to call bullies, all bullies, narcissists, or to say bullies are narcissists. Sometimes what a bully does seems narcissistic. That doesn't make bullies narcissists. And I find it very problematic. And for the people who are still being bullied, when we think bullies are easily identifiable. And because then when you have an accusation of bully and you have this idea of who or what the type of bully looks like, and the person who's being accused of in your organization doesn't fit that mold, you automatically dismiss the fact that there's bullying in your organization, which is essentially giving your bully in your organization a green light to keep doing it. Okay? And so, who does bully? Well, that's a good question. And I have, just like everybody else, I have my own opinions on it. And again, I just said it in case you missed it. Anybody who comes into a workplace bullying situation can become the workplace bully. And so one of the things oftentimes, if you've ever listened to or worked with a bully, they have some tapes that they repeat, okay? And victimhood is often a tape that bullies play. I'm actually the one being bullied. I'm the one being mistreated. That's a tape they play over and over. And if you think about it logically and rationally, is that many times, again, depending on how long that bully has been in the workplace, they could have very likely started out as the person who was bullied, and they role shifted to bystander or into being a bully. So they might have started, I want to say it again, they might have started off as the person who was bullied, okay, then shifted to another role of bystander, or maybe they shifted from person being bullied to the person who was bullying, because it's extremely disempowering to be the one being bullied, and you have no power, and everybody in the organization is against you. So oftentimes there's a role shift, and when bullies say they've been a victim, it's very likely they may have started out in that role. Okay, that doesn't justify their behavior, or they don't get a free pass because they were bullied. They should know better. But it does, if you think about it, it makes sense to why they think they are the ones being bullied. Okay? And so I've seen bullies come and go. Okay? And that role is, again, it's a role where people are seen as powerful. They might be on the same level as you are, but they can create fear, and they're manipulating lots of things that are happening behind the scenes. I think of bullies oftentimes a little bit like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, kind of in the back, manipulating everybody's roles and how people are behaving. People don't understand. They don't have that organizational consciousness to understand what the person is doing. You can't see the bigger picture when you're the one being bullied. You can't see the bigger picture if you're HR. If you don't know that behind the curtain, there's a wizard. Okay? If that makes sense. So, I have my own theory about people who are bullied. It's anybody can be a bully. But generally, what I've seen over the course of 20 years, having viewed a lot of bullies, is they generally have decent qualities. These are not people that you totally dislike. They can fit in and seem like, quote unquote, normal. Okay? They can adapt to the situations they are in, and many times they are just regular, everyday people who have gotten ahead, probably further than they would have by bullying, because they use bullying to create an atmosphere of fear, and that has gotten them further. And when there comes somebody they don't like, or they bully and they want that person out of the organization, then they do enough bullying to make that person look bad, so they either get fired or they leave on their own. And so that becomes the problem then for us, is that bullies bully because it's working for them. They're getting everything in the organization. They have a lot of power. It's powerful to watch people shrink away from you. It's powerful to see that you have Betty the bystander who will go after Jan because Bob said to. Or Bob didn't even have to say, he just nodded his head and Betty went after me. That's power. That's a kind of power that most of us don't think about having because we never have it. Okay? And so the myths around who is a bully protects the bully and hurts those of us who are in bully culture. Okay? And the other thing that it does is you think that you can't be a bully. The reality is if you're in bully culture, you can. Okay? I've seen people come in one day and 2 or 3 days later evaluate and assess the situation and become somebody's bully. Just like that. It doesn't always happen that quickly, but sometimes it does, because in organizations, we like the status quo. We want homeostasis. In order to do that, in a dysfunctional organization, you have to have the role of bully, bystander, and person who's being bullied. Okay? So what does that mean? I think what it means are a couple of things, okay? Is we need to have more accurate education about who's the workplace bully. Meaning academics, get out there and do some research, okay? Start asking questions, not to victims of workplace bullying, right? Because I have a biased perspective about the people who bullied me, okay? I'm always going to say I was better than they are. In fact, I talked to a friend of mine just the other day, and she said these exact words. Well, we were better professors than they were. Bullying doesn't have anything to do with that. Bullying has everything to do with the person who's maintaining power and the bully. It has nothing to do with who I am. It has everything to do with who they are and the organizational culture that's allowing it to happen. Okay? And if we think that only those type of people are bullies, then we're dismissing complaints and accusations against people who don't fit that bill that are really being bullies. Okay? And it becomes extremely problematic. Okay? And so it makes people feel safe when we think it's those type of people. Okay? So what can you do? That's a good question. Okay? Right? I think what you can do is find as much information about bullying as possible. You can go to Stop Bully Culture. I have a great resource hub on my shop. I have information about bullies. But what I would recommend, and I think this is probably the best thing you can do, is if you are in HR, or you are in leadership, or if you're the one being bullied, sit back and watch what that person is doing, how they're engaging, how they're bullying, because you can learn a lot by just sitting back and watching them. And if that person is really a bully, it will become fairly clear to you. Okay. And the other thing is, when you know what they're doing, you can develop strategies to combat that. Okay. So if they're yelling at you in meetings, you can develop ways to shut that down without them ever knowing. But I think the biggest thing that leaders and people in HR have to understand is bullying is not an interpersonal conflict problem. It is not a problem between me and Bob. It's an organizational problem, and you have to take a system-wide perspective to understand what Bob is doing and how it's affecting the organization. And one clue that I think should be, on everybody's radar, if you're in a position where you're investigating or taking complaints, is when you have an organization where you have 9 people versus 1, that in and of itself should tell you that you have an organizational problem that is not just about that one person. More often than not, it's about the other 9 and what they're doing. Excuse me. It's about the other 9 and what they're doing together. And so understanding how bullies operate and understanding that everybody can be a workplace bullying should help you understand that your organization could also be plagued with workplace bullying. I did want to say thank you for watching and thank you for being here. And the other thing, I also, if you haven't gone to my podcast, Exposing Workplace Bullying, we have one more episode in the season. And next season, which will start in a couple of weeks, one of the things I'm going to do is to actually talk about more specifically the man behind the curtain, or Bob the bully, and how people become bullies and how bullies operate. So I would love it if you would like and subscribe here and also over there. And again, if there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to contact me.